Well, thanks ever so much, John. Thank you very much to all the people who've just organising this superb conference, and it's really been something I've been looking forward to. I hope you can understand me. I'm speaking English, of course. I love to say that to the Americans in particular, but you guys have a few issues as well, but they're not as major as when I'm visiting America. But there we go. I'm talking now about the flood, the Babel and the nations, and the Chinese language. As you can see, a Chinese script up there, which we'll come to. And we're just going to do a few things to show you really the authority of this book, the Bible. This talk is actually on the bookstall there, the resources stall, Genesis, Babel, and the Chinese language, and you'll find a much younger version of me giving that talk some years ago. My own book, Genesis for Today, is there as well. A lot of the ideas that I'm sharing now are really in that book as well, although that's covering the gospel and covering the biblical issues, much like John was saying earlier. And then it also does cover some of the historical issues that I'm going to be talking about now. John Osgood's book, Egypt, Israel, and the Exodus, is actually very relevant to this as well. So please do be looking at the bookstore at the first opportunity. There are limited resources. We couldn't get loads of things sent to you. Out here, we had 50 of each sent, and it all got here safely. I just need to remind you that this is the true timeline of the Bible. Adam to Noah is roughly 1,000 years. Noah to Abraham is roughly another 1,000 years. Abraham to David, roughly speaking, is about 1,000 years. David to Christ, another 1,000 years. Where does that come from? Where do we get that from? Genesis 5, Genesis 11, the genealogies. People think, oh, it's so boring going through the genealogies. Actually, when you read those genealogies, God is giving you a perspective as to where you are, where you fit. Do you realize this is the only book which actually has an authoritative timeline which goes from the past to the present where we are, and as John was sharing earlier as he was quoting verses in Revelation and talking about the fact that we should be fearing the God who made everything, and of course that book of Revelation is mainly talking about the future. So we have a book which joins the dots of past, present, and future. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So it's hardly surprising that God gives us a perspective which is past, present, and future, and shows us the true timeline. You go to any other religion, not even Islam has a timeline. It has surahs, some of which are referring to Abraham and other people, verses basically, but it's not divinely inspired. And no other book, Buddhism, Hinduism, all the other religions, none of them has a true timeline, whereas the Bible does. We don't know when Christ will return, but we know that there is a coming judgment. This is God's clock of history. Now, Genesis 5 and 11 have been often questioned, and often, people have tried to say that you could get names in there, that you could actually make it longer than what it appears to be. But actually, because those names are repeated 4 times in all, but if we regard Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 as one, because one is going to Noah and the other one's going to Abraham, that's Genesis 5 and 11, you could say that it's certainly three times. 1 Chronicles 1 repeats the names again. And then Luke 3, speaking of the genealogy of Christ through Mary, just as John was saying earlier, Matthew is primarily a book written to the Jews, and it goes back to Abraham, and it doesn't go through Mary's line. If you read carefully, you'll find that the genealogy goes through Joseph's line. It's the only conclusion you can come to. But Luke is going through Mary's line. And that timeline is actually built then on these genealogies. And the point I'm making here is that those names are repeated. So if God says something once, we say, well, that's important. But if he says it twice, that's very important. If he says it 3 times, we've no reason in any way to doubt what God has said. In fact, because in Genesis 5 and 11, it actually tells you how old the father was when his son is born, and then says, and he lived so many more years and he died, you can't get a razor blade into the argument. Even if you were to actually say, well, it means that this is the descendant of, you still don't gain more time. You don't actually remove the actual timeline. Other verses which will be useful to you if you want to follow this through. As a young Christian, I drew charts and actually put them up on the wall, and I worked it all out, and I thought, boy, the Bible really does have a timeline. 1 Kings 6:1, Galatians 3:17 help you to jump over some of the difficult areas, like in the Kings and also in the Exodus. But Galatians 3:17 talks about 430 years in Egypt. 1 Kings 6:1 talks about from the Exodus to the building of the temple, and it's roughly 1,000 years. So that's where this timeline comes from. The timeline, of course, is referred to in the New Testament. The creation, the fall, and the flood are vital to the apostolic writings. Paul refers to Adam and Eve. And he builds a whole argument on the fact that Adam brings death in Romans 5, summarized in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 22 and 24. And there is other verses there that you can see on the screen, where Paul is building arguments specifically on the fact that there was a historical Adam. Look at 1 Timothy 2, a much contended issue today in the church. Nobody's playing down, ladies, but God does say that Adam is to be the head and Eve is to be the helpmeet. It's not that God is saying that there is to be tyrannical rule. That, of course, is wrong. But God is saying that there should be male leadership in the church. And how is that argument built up? It's built up because Adam was made first and Eve came from Adam. Well, if that's not building on the historical accuracy of what's described in Genesis, then what is? You can see very clearly that the whole argument concerning authority comes from a literal Adam and Eve. Peter refers to a literal Noah in a difficult verse in 1 Peter 3:20, but also in 2 Peter 2, and of course he develops it in 2 Peter 3, speaking about the flood. Christ referred to Adam and Eve as real people. As in the beginning, God made them male and female. He refers to the blood of Abel, to the blood of Zechariah. He refers to Noah. He refers, of course, to the flood. There is absolutely no doubt that the New Testament and the Old Testament are promoting a timeline of literal history. The lesson from the early genealogies, of course, is the flood, and God brought the flood. The flood was actually essentially prophesied, though, as you can see, from Enoch here, whom I've highlighted because he was taken. God took him because he was walking with God and he pleased God, and God took him. He didn't die. But look at what he called his name, his son, the name Methuselah. I haven't written it up there, but Methuselah means when he is dead, it will come. So just think about it for a moment. Enoch's sort of got this child, and everybody's delighted that this child is born. Oh, don't trip up. Oh, be careful. Once this child dies, it will be it. You can imagine what they would have been thinking of as Enoch was running around. As Methuselah, was running around. Methuselah lived to 969 years with that name. In other words, nearly 1,000 years, God had given a warning that there was a judgment coming. So these names are very important. And as we were told, God would bring rest. And do you know, Noah's name means rest. And God was going to bring a person who, despite all the conflict that was going to engulf the world, literally in geographical and geological disaster, God would finally bring rest through what? Through Noah building the ark. These are amazing truths. 2 Peter actually refers to these events, as I mentioned earlier, and it says, where is the promise of his coming? For this they are willingly ignorant, this is talking about the second coming, right? That by the word of God, the heavens were of old. Then it talks about whereby the world that then was perished. Then it says, by the same word, this world that we have now is kept in store for judgment, not by water, but by fire. I love 2 Peter 3 because it stresses that the word of God was used at creation. The word of God brings the flood, and the word of God finally brings the end of all things. Well, why did the flood come? The Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. And it says that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So God brought the flood because there was great wickedness. Does that ring true a bit to us today? Of course it does. Because Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the day of the Son of Man. There was great wickedness before the flood came. In other places, it speaks of God seeing that there was just violence throughout all the world. That there was the imaginations of their hearts was only evil continually. God saw that wickedness was great, and that's what brought the flood. What, though, was the flood? And what was the ark? Many people have tried to say that it was a local flood. But you know, it couldn't have been a local flood. Because you know that after the Genesis flood, the rainbow promise is described. And God says, I will never do it again. And this is my sign that I'll never do it again. He puts the rainbow in the sky. Do you have rainbows here? You have so much sunshine. I'm not sure that you get much rainbows, but we have them a lot in England. And of course you have them here. Every time you see that bow, it's a reminder of God's covenant with man, that he will never flood the world again. Why does that speak of a global flood? Well, think about it. Malawi, a year or so back, virtually all of Malawi was underwater in a terrible flood. Bangladesh has also known terrible floods. The tsunami in 2004 under the Indian Ocean swept 250,000 people in one day into eternity. Right? Well, just a minute. If God is saying that it will never bring a local flood again, God's broken his promise. I've just named 1 or 2 disasters. There's been many more. You can see that Scripture, both in the Old and the New Testament, is teaching that the flood was a worldwide global event. Now, what about the ark? Was it like that? Of course, that's fiction, and that's nonsense. And by the way, can I just suggest that we don't use those drawings of the ark in our Sunday schools? Because they cause an awful lot of damage to young Christians young children who are growing up in church. Because they're seeking to be taught the things of Christ, things that are to do with the gospel. And many of the churches that John was referring to earlier, they don't see the importance of teaching the foundations properly. And if you sowed the seed that the flood was just a jolly event where there was a jolly ark, and everybody was happy, and everybody went in happy, and they all came out happy, it just gives the idea of a cuddly little story which can be forgotten later on. Just like we don't believe in Santa Claus anymore, we don't believe in fairies anymore, and we don't believe in Noah's Ark. And that's often what happens in teenage years. People who've been brought up with not proper teaching about Genesis in the church end up actually dismissing the whole of Genesis. The real ark was something like that, as you could see at the bottom. And the one that we just considered wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes, 5 seconds probably, on the huge waters and huge heaving seas that were coming across the globe in the days of the ark. Noah's ark was very large, well constructed to take all the land creatures, probably of the order of, depending what you say the cubit was, but it was something of about 150 meters. You've progressed here, haven't you? We haven't progressed very much in England. We do use meters a bit, but not as much as you do. So I've got to translate this. It was about 150 meters long, and it was about 15 meters tall and 25 meters wide. That's big. That's huge. And it was about 1.5 times as long as a traditional football field in the States. I'm not quite sure whether that would be the same here, but you'll have to translate it. Just there are a few little oddities and language issues here, but we won't go into great detail on that. It was big. The other thing is that Noah's Ark could list even at a 60-degree angle and still right itself. How do we get that? Well, we have to estimate roughly where the center of gravity of Noah's Ark would be and what the center of buoyancy would be. No doubt Noah wouldn't put the larger creatures on the top deck. There was 3 decks. He puts the larger animals probably on the lower deck, and so that there would be weight would tend to be near the bottom. But whatever your calculations that you do here, you end up roughly with the fact that the ark could be very, very stable in those high seas. The ark was built for stability. Nobody knows what those seas would have looked like. This is just an artist's impression, obviously, of the sorts of waves that would have been around in those huge seas that would have been coming right across the globe. But it was built that men and women in the ark would be saved, the 8 people, and that the animals also could propagate afterwards. And by the way, would it include dinosaurs? And the answer is it would. Because dinosaurs were made, just as all the other creatures, land creatures, on the 6th day. So that means that these creatures would have been on the ark as well. If you get the ark wrong, then you've got this ridiculous situation of squeezing large creatures into an ark, which is unbiblical anyway. But if you get it right, that one's obviously fiction. If you get it right and you remember that dinosaurs start off as embryos in eggs, so there's every indication that dinosaurs were essentially reptiles. Although some people have tried to argue differently, it does rather look very strongly that dinosaurs were large reptiles. Therefore, like crocodiles, they start off as eggs, and also like crocodiles, they'll carry on growing and growing and growing and growing, and they don't stop. So Noah would take young dinosaurs, probably, into the ark. And the large dinosaurs he would put on the lower deck. We don't know that each deck was exactly the same height, but on average about 5 meters. Maybe the lower deck was slightly higher. Then all the animals, including the dinosaurs, would have come out of the ark. Very interesting that in certain parts of the world there are records of people seeing even dinosaurs. So dinosaurs in the main were buried with all the other creatures outside the ark which died in the flood. That's why we find fossils of them. Even in England, we've begun to find fossils of dinosaurs on the Isle of Wight, which is an island on the south of England. We've found evidence of dinosaur tracks in England. I went to Peru not so long ago, and there was dinosaur tracks in the middle of the mountains, in the middle of nowhere, just exposed in the rock. Dinosaur tracks have been found in many places. But that's the ones that died in the ark. What about the ones that came off the ark? Well, people have drawn interesting carvings in some places, like this temple, which is about 1,000 years old or so. It's difficult to date this temple, which is at Angkor Wat in Cambodia. But you can find what looks distinctly like a stegosaurus carved on that temple. Well, how did that person carve that? If it is a stegosaurus, well, it must mean that he was actually seeing one. These are not fictional creatures. There are other creatures which are recognizable as creatures we have today, but then there are other creatures that we don't have today. Some people have tried to argue, and this is the way the evolutionists and people who don't accept what I'm saying try to argue. They say, well, just as there's leaves carved around here, the person who did the carving also decided to put some leaves there as well. Well, if that's the case, why didn't he put leaves around here? It's obvious that that is a very weak argument. Even a child can look at that and say, hey, that's a stegosaurus. So that means that guys who were living in those days saw these creatures. We could speak of other examples that are in other parts of the world where people have seen large creatures. Examples in China, examples even in England where there are brass carvings of dinosaurs in Carlisle Cathedral. I won't show them to you now because I want to move on now to remind you of what I said just now, that the flood was global and the waters prevailed, were increased greatly upon the earth, and they covered the whole earth. I want you now to realize that there are accounts of the flood outside the Bible. Russia to Lapland, China to Mexico has records of the flood. And they are found in nations which sometimes have verbal memories of the flood. And these nations would include even out here in Australia. The Aborigines didn't write things down, but they do have a memory of a worldwide flood. So God actually had people remembering this event. Some people wrote it down. Clearly, he instructed people such as Noah to write down what had happened. And we have that in the scriptures. But we also have it recorded in other places outside the Bible as well. There are records, of course, in Babylon. But Babylon has the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the ark, in that case, was a cube. And it was 7 stories high. And it would have just rolled on the big oceans. So it clearly isn't the original. It's a corruption. And yet people try to say, oh, that's the original, and the Bible is a copy. Speaking of Babylon and Babel, that, of course, leads us now to the post-flood dispersion, which I want to now refer to. The next disaster that God brings is not a disaster by water, not a disaster by fire, which is to come, but he does come down and see that man again is rebelling against him. We read this in Genesis 11, where it says, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." They're not trusting in God. They're not doing as John was saying earlier. They're not fearing God. And again, man is drifting away from God. And he's trying to avoid things ever happening again like the flood. So they have a memory of the flood. And they're trying to appease gods in the stars. Possibly that's why they built this great big tower. And God said, the people has become one. He came down and looked at what they were doing. And they've all one language. And then he says, interestingly, nothing will be restrained, that should say restrained from them, which they've imagined to do. So the Lord scattered them abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Let's now consider this dispersal. It's very interesting when we look at it. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We're after the flood now. And this table of the nations in Genesis 10 is a very interesting description of the peoples as they spread throughout the whole world. Many people dismiss not only Genesis 6 to 9 about the flood, not only Genesis 1, 2, 3 about the reality of Adam and the Garden of Eden, but they dismiss Genesis 10 and 11. Let me just say that not only have I written this book, Genesis for Today, I've just got the proofs done of another book, which is a commentary on Genesis 1 to 11, again published by Day One. Sorry, I haven't got it with me yet. It's not yet come out, but it's just about to come out. And it goes verse by verse throughout the whole of Genesis 1 to 11. I'd like to encourage you to consider buying that. You'd have to order it through Day One. Maybe it'll come onto Amazon pretty quickly, so you should be able to get it here as well. But many people dismiss the post-flood period as well. But God clearly tells us that Japheth, his sons were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Now, how interesting. When we actually consider these names, we see that this is essentially the European nations. And I've highlighted some of the names here because Gomer is reckoned by some, and there is evidence which would seek to support this, that he is the ancestor of the Celts. Henry Morris has written much about this in his writings. He, of course, is really the great-grandfather of the modern creation movement, and he put a lot of thought in his commentary on Genesis. And he and others have taken the view that Gomer is the ancestor of the Celts because of the similarity even of the word Gomer, for instance, with Cymraeg, the language of the Welsh, the language of Gomer. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, which is often linked with the name for Germany, the old descriptions of the Germanic peoples. Togarmah, possibly it's Turkey. France, Galatia, and that certainly is the old name for France. Spain, Galicia, again got this connection with the idea of the Celts, the Gauls. So, what about Magog? Well, Magog, we have this prophetic reference. If you understand this, you're certainly better than me. I struggle every time I read Ezekiel, but certainly prophetically it mentions Magog. Josephus links Magog with Scythia, Romania, and Ukraine. Talks about the place of the north. This is the places near Russia. And it's the Slavic peoples. But it's still the sons of Japheth. Then you've got Madai, also come from Japheth. And Elam, which comes from Shem. So Iran, which is the Persia, used to be called Persia, has two peoples. And it's very interesting that Madai is the lighter colored people, and Shem, the Elamites from Shem, would be the darker peoples in that nation. And even today, we have a lot of Iranians come to my church, which I go to in Manchester, near Manchester, and they will say, yeah, there's two parts to our nation. There is the northern part and the southern part. Generally, it splits that way. The later Medes, it's reckoned, went to India. Javan is Greece, and Javan is a son of Japheth. We're following the sons of Japheth. Tubal is probably connected with Georgia, which is close to the area just near Ukraine that I was talking about earlier. And that we're not at Ukraine, but we're just further south in the area of Georgia, where there was a invasion by the Russians recently. It's that area, or some years ago now. And Josephus has the name as the Thobalites. See the link with Tubal? And the capital of that area is Tbilisi. I flew right over Tbilisi. And as the Singapore Airlines flight was going over, gradually inching its way, dearie me, it takes ages coming from England to Singapore. But it flew right over Tbilisi. And I thought, yes, that's exactly what Genesis 10 says. Later migration would go across the Caucasian mountains to another place called Tobolsk. Then you've got Meshek. Many people think that that name is linked to Moscow. And it's still even today called the Meshera lowland near Moscow. Isn't this amazing? Tiras, linked to Thrace and Macedonia, the region which used to be called Yugoslavia. Then you've got the other sons. We've got, of course, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, Canaan, and the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah, and so on. And Cush begat Nimrod. So the sons of Ham led to Nimrod. And Nimrod, of course, is the one who built the Babel. And this was the Babel which God went down to deal with the tower and actually broke away from their building of that tower. Now, we don't know all these names, what they refer to. For instance, we think that the Sinites is referring to Sinim, China, because Isaiah has a reference to that as well. So that would support the thesis that China is mainly from Ham, although some have suggested that they are a very large nation and that there is a mixture in China, and that could well be. Some have suggested that there could be an influence of Shem, particularly when we come to the last bit of my talk and you see that they were aware in their language of many of the things which were taught in the Old Testament. So we have then Shem. Unto Shem, the father of the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born. Now, I did show you earlier this amazing prophecy, which I just want to draw to your attention again, that Japheth was going to be the one who would be the elder, and that the elder would serve the younger. Sorry, I beg your pardon, I got that wrong. He would be the brother of Japheth the elder, right? And we've got this prophecy concerning the fact that Japheth would be the one who would dominate in the future world. I'm coming to that point, so just bear that in mind, because this reference to Japheth the elder is very important. But dealing with Shem, we've got Persia, whom I've already said is two nations. We've got Ashur, Assyria, Arphax, probably linked to the Chaldeans. Lud is probably linked to Lydia in western Turkey. And Aram is certainly the old name for Syria. So Elam is the other part to Iran. So this is the bit from Shem. So now as we look on a little diagram to show how the nations spread out from the Middle East, we've got Ham going west to Africa, southwest, Japheth going up through Greece to Europe, and Shem going essentially east, but not very far. Shem is the one who is based in the Middle East. Japheth goes to Europe. Ham goes to Africa. Because he's the traveler and the one who is advancing technologically, he's the one who's probably the one who actually goes across the seas as well. We actually have indications that Ham would have moved not only right east, but would have possibly gone over the Bering Strait and come to be the ancestor of the American Indians and the South American Indians. It would also apply, of course, to the Aborigines and the Maoris in New Zealand. So we have here a model which does actually explain much of the dispersion that we actually see today. The population of the world is 7 billion. When you actually wind that back, you come to about 500 million at the time of Christ. everything is suggesting that we did indeed come out of the Middle East as a post-flood dispersion, just as the Bible says, of the order of 4,500 years ago. Then, of course, Japheth, proud Japheth, of whom it was said that he would be the elder and would dominate, he indeed did dominate. And it doesn't justify him, by the way, but he would dominate because God had said that that would happen. And that's exactly what has happened. The European nations, not all good, in fact, a lot of it very harmful. The conquistadors from Spain were brutal with the South Americans. We weren't very good with the American Indians. And yet everything was coming true, that Japheth would meet, finally, the descendants of his brother across the seas. Let me now come to something very interesting concerning the Chinese. The Chinese, as I said earlier, have in their writings mankind plus one mouth, plus gives them the sense of united. In their writing, they actually have references to what I've been saying concerning all the events of Genesis. It's really stunning. Mankind was of one mouth, and that gives us the hieroglyph, the Chinese hieroglyph or Chinese script for the word united. If we now add the word grass, we have the sense of undertake. If we now add the word for clay, we get the word tower. That seems to be a very interesting reference to the Tower of Babel. If you take the word for great and division, you get also with the word for west, you get the word for walking. You might say, well, why west? Well, because from China's point of view, Eden and all the events described in Genesis about the flood, then coming later, is all to do with revolving around the Middle East. So for them, in the post-flood world, where no Eden now existed, but there would be a sense that the ark had originally come onto the mountains of Ararat, way over there in the west. And we had to walk a long way from the west to get to where we are now. And that gives us the word for migration. So in the Chinese mentality, there was always this memory that they'd walked from the west to where they are now. Now, John actually has done far more work on this than I have. I'm just giving you the biblical framework, but I would really recommend John Osgood's book, which I mentioned earlier, Egypt, Israel, and the Exodus, but I'm going to also mention his other book in a moment, which he's coming out shortly. In fact, it should be out by the end of this week, where he's done a huge amount of work looking at these various post-flood civilizations and their kings and their genealogies. And he shows that the biblical timeline is indeed the correct one. And the one which is very contentious is the Egyptian chronology. And he shows that the Egyptian chronology is actually being bloated, as it were. And really, it's the biblical one which has got the correct chronology. And he has actually got markers which actually fit in so well with other events going on in these other nations. But essentially, Babel and Babylon would have been founded after the flood, which was about BC 2000, roughly BC 2500. So you've got Babylon being founded in this area, and roughly 500 years after this, we haven't got it marked here, but it's about here, about 2000 or so, Abraham is leaving Babylon. So The Tower of Babel is here, 2242, roughly, and Egypt is founded somewhere in that region, BC 2200. People love to think, those who are secular archaeologists, love to think as Egypt going back 5,000, 6,000 years. No, no, no. It's not as old as people think. It goes back basically to just after the flood, which would be BC 4,000, roughly 4,200 years ago. Just to draw this to a close, it says in Genesis 10, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided. In his days, Peleg's days, was the earth divided. By these were the nations divided. Many people have tried to talk about a post-flood split again, or literally the earth's crust. That's not what's being referred to here. That word has the sense to navigate. And this is borne out by an amazing set of maps that are available only because people have rediscovered these after many years. Here's a very old map called the Piri-Reis map, which was put together in 1513, but it appears to be a copy of an older map. And the amazing thing is that although it's not, in this case, got latitude too well, it appears to have got longitude, which is the most difficult one to actually get. It appears to have got that exceedingly well indeed. It appears to be a map showing the coast of South America and even going down to Antarctica, which is extremely interesting because Antarctica today is completely locked up in ice. It's very difficult to see the coastline. So we have here things which are strongly indicating that the flood and the post-flood dispersion are actually being remembered in other civilizations. I'll just mention to you one other interesting point. Way out in South America, there is a well-known dry stone wall with 20-ton blocks in it, which you can't get a razor blade between. These guys knew how to build. But interestingly, though they were so technologically brilliant, some of them actually had markings on these stones, not in Peru, but in Bolivia, which were markings which showed that there was negroid features in them, in the statues, which would indicate that this is Ham having crossed the southern Atlantic, and not necessarily all of them having gone across the Bering Strait. Coming back to the Chinese again, the Chinese have a record of the old border sacrifice that the emperors used to keep. Just look at this and compare it with Genesis 1. Of old in the beginning there was the great chaos, without form and dark. The 5 elements, that means planets, had not begun to revolve, nor the sun and the moon to shine. You, O spiritual sovereign, first divided the grosser parts from the purer. You made heaven, you made earth, you made man. All things with their reproducing power got their being. That is stunning, isn't it? What a striking similarity to Genesis chapter 1. Here's some other Chinese pictographs. Dust plus breath plus alive gives the word to talk. It's also linked with the word mouth. As you can see, some of that is in the word mouth. If you take the word to talk and you add walking, you get the word create. So man is a walking, talking creation from dust. Get it? Isn't that amazing? The first man was a living dust man. Let's just have a look at that. First is made up of alive, as I've just said, plus dust, plus man. So the word first emphasizes that the first man was a living dustman. How about that? That's written in Chinese. Blessing and happiness is to do with God and one, and man and the garden. In the beginning, God and man had close fellowship that leads to true happiness. And just to end with, this is a lovely one about which reflects from, or seems to come from Noah. God's truth being handed down to Noah. This is the word to hand down. Mouth, which I mentioned earlier, people, ate, and water gives you the word to hand down and to continue. These are all, by the way, in a book which is called The Discovery of Genesis, which I haven't got here, but you can, I believe, still get it. I believe that there is another book, but I couldn't get the image of it. But you will have to go on to the Creation Research website. Also, you can use the Answers in Genesis website, that sister work. You'll find that there are some of these books available. The one that I mentioned by John is this one. It's not out yet, but it's just coming. And I would recommend that you get hold of it. Sign the sheet for John's book at the back. It's a very important message that comes out of the Bible. This gives us the framework to understand archaeology, to understand true history. May God be praised.